heated encounter. At midday, the scorching Texas heat enveloped the small town, the air thick and oppressive under a hazy layer of dust. Most residents sought refuge under the cool hum of air conditioners. On the long, straight main road, a sleek black SUV appeared in the distance, its glossy surface reflecting the unforgiving sunlight. The glare made it seem like the car was floating above the burning asphalt. Officer Derek Brown sat in his patrol car, boredom weighing heavy on his mind. Sipping iced coffee from a plastic cup, he sighed. The day had been painfully uneventful. No accidents, no violations, just the heat and an all-encompassing silence. He glanced at the speed radar, expecting nothing, when the sharp beep of the device broke the monotony. Brown's eyes darted to the screen. 72 p.m. each. A violation. In this stretch, the speed limit was only 55 p.m. each. Excitement surged through him. Finally, he muttered, setting down his coffee. He flipped on his police lights and hit the gas, chasing after the luxury SUV in the distance. In Brown's mind, no one could outrun him in this town. He knew every inch of the roads and relished the control he held over his jurisdiction. This, he thought, was the moment he'd been waiting for, a chance to break the monotony and prove himself. Adrenaline coursed through his veins as he closed the gap. The SUV didn't speed up or slow down, maintaining its steady pace. Brown wasn't worried. Confident in his authority, he imagined how this would play out, a quick ticket and a stern warning. As the SUV pulled over, Brown braked sharply, stepping out of his patrol car with purpose. Adjusting his belt and cap, he approached the vehicle, his focus unwavering. The driver's side door of the black SUV creaked open. Out stepped a tall man dressed in a perfectly tailored dark blue suit. His upright posture and composed demeanor radiated confidence. But Brown didn't notice, or rather, he chose not to. To him, this was just another traffic stop, another lawbreaker to reprimand. "License and registration," Brown demanded, his tone firm and dismissive, avoiding eye contact. To him, this was routine. Ask for paperwork, issue a ticket, and move on. The man silently handed over his documents, his expression calm. As Brown glanced at the license, his breath caught, his hand trembling slightly. The name printed on the card was almost unbelievable. General Marcus Evans. Brown read the name aloud, his eyes widening. Marcus Evans. A renowned military leader, a man who had commanded major campaigns abroad and was celebrated as a hero by many. Brown had seen his face on the news before, but the recognition did little to quell the wave of irritation rising within him. "You know you broke the law, don't you?" Brown asked coldly, his tone laced with defiance. He ignored the rank on the ID and focused only on the violation. To Brown, Evans was just another driver who thought himself above the rules. "I exceeded the speed limit and fully accept responsibility for that," Evans replied, his tone steady and composed. His calmness only fanned the flames of Brown's irritation. Why is he so calm? Does he think he's untouchable just because of his rank? Brown thought, his frustration bubbling to the surface. He scrutinized the man before him, a symbol of everything he resented: wealth, power, success. People like Evans seemed to live in a world untouched by struggle, where rules were merely suggestions. Brown's own life had been a stark contrast. He had grown up in a poor neighborhood, facing daily challenges and injustices that had hardened him over time. Life had been an uphill battle, a relentless fight for survival. Seeing someone like Evans, so calm, so composed, felt like a personal affront, a reminder of the chasm between their worlds. Brown's anger swelled as he locked eyes with Evans. The general's calm demeanor felt like a subtle challenge, as if he was silently asserting control over the situation. To Brown, it was unbearable. He thinks he can just stand there and walk away like nothing happened? Not this time. "Hands on the car," Brown ordered abruptly, stepping closer. Evans hesitated briefly, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, but he complied without resistance. Slowly, he placed his hands on the glossy hood of the SUV. Brown's frustration deepened. Evans's calm compliance felt less like submission and more like quiet defiance. It was as if he was undermining Brown's authority without saying a word. "You think you're getting away with this?" Brown spat, grabbing Evans' wrist and twisting it behind his back with unnecessary force. He pressed Evans against the car, his voice rising in anger. You're just like the rest of them, thinking the rules don't apply to you. Evans remained composed, his voice soft but firm. What did I do wrong? Brown's grip tightened, his anger boiling over. Don't act like you're above this, he snapped, his voice trembling with rage. In that moment, it wasn't just about the traffic stop. It was about years of feeling overlooked, years of seeing people like Evans walk away unscathed while others bore the weight of consequences. What did I do wrong? Evans repeated, his tone sharper now. His question wasn't just directed at the situation, it was cutting through the irrationality of Brown's anger. For a fleeting moment, Brown hesitated. Deep down, he knew his actions weren't about enforcing the law. They were about his own frustrations. Just then, the sound of a siren broke through the tension. Another patrol car pulled up, and Lieutenant John Martinez stepped out. Martinez, a seasoned officer and Brown's longtime colleague, immediately sensed the escalating situation. Derek, what's going on here? Martinez asked, his tone calm but firm. Brown didn't turn, his voice sharp. I'm arresting a lawbreaker. Martinez's eyes widened as he recognized the man before him. Derek, wait a minute, he said, his voice serious. This is General Marcus Evans. Brown whipped around, his face contorted with anger. So what, he snapped. You think he gets a pass because he's a general? Not on my watch. Martinez glanced between the two men, understanding the delicate situation. He knew Brown's temper and the consequences this could have, not just for Brown, but for the department as a whole. Keeping his composure, Martinez stepped forward, determined to de-escalate the situation before it spiraled further out of control. The breaking point? Martinez lowered his voice, his tone calm but firm. Derek, you know we can't handle this like you're doing. General Evans isn't just any ordinary citizen. He's dedicated his life to this country. If we don't handle this carefully, there'll be consequences you can't begin to foresee. But Brown refused to back down. His pride and anger consumed him, clouding his judgment. Does he think he can do whatever he wants just because he's a general? Brown retorted, his voice tight with defiance. Martinez sighed, realizing his words weren't getting through. Derek, think about what you're doing, he said slowly. This isn't just about you. If this goes public, you'll be the one held responsible. You're not just representing yourself. You're representing the entire force. Don't let your emotions lead you down a path you'll regret. Brown clenched his jaw, the truth in Martinez's words starting to sink in. For a moment, hesitation flickered in his eyes, but the internal battle between his ego and reason raged on. He tightened his grip on Evans's wrist, as if holding onto his authority with every ounce of strength he had left. Evans stood silently, his composure unshaken. His calmness only added to Brown's discomfort, forcing him to second-guess his actions. Then the situation escalated further. The spectacle begins. A car pulled up across the street. From inside, a man in a suit stepped out, holding a video camera. He was a reporter, likely from a local news outlet. Without hesitation, he began recording the scene unfolding before him. Brown caught a glimpse of the camera, and frustration flared within him. The presence of the reporter turned the already tense situation into a public spectacle. Bystanders began to gather, some pulling out their phones to record as well. The pressure of being filmed, judged by so many eyes, pushed Brown closer to the edge. Martinez saw the danger, placing a hand on Brown's shoulder. He leaned in and spoke firmly. Derek, stop. Don't do something you'll regret. But Brown shrugged him off, his pride refusing to let him back down. I'm in control here, he shouted, his voice laced with desperation. You have no right to interfere. Martinez's face tightened with concern. He could see the spiral. Brown was losing control, his anger driving him further into a situation that would be impossible to undo. Meanwhile, the crowd grew larger, the hum of murmurs and the glow of phone screens amplifying the tension. A voice of authority. Despite his restrained hands, General Evans remained calm, his gaze steady. Officer, you need to understand that your actions will have serious consequences, he said, his tone even but commanding. Not because I'm a general, but because I'm a citizen of this country. You cannot violate my rights out of anger. Evans's words struck a nerve. Brown felt as though his authority was slipping away, his grasp on the situation weakening with every second. To Brown, Evans's calm demeanor was a provocation, a challenge to his power. It was unbearable. You think you can talk to me like that? Brown growled, his voice trembling. I won't let you get away with this. Evans tilted his head slightly, his gaze piercing. Using force won't solve anything, he said, his voice sharp yet composed. We all have responsibilities under the law, and so do you. I won't resist, but if you persist, you will face consequences, and I don't want that for you. The words cut through Brown's anger like a knife, but instead of calming him, they ignited a storm of emotions. Humiliation, rage, and confusion, the weight of the bystanders' stares, the unwavering composure of Evans, and Martinez's warnings collided in his mind. Deep down, he knew he had gone too far, yet his pride wouldn't let him stop. The turning point. Martinez stepped forward again, his voice stronger now. Derek, this has gone far enough. Let him go. Don't ruin your career over this. Brown stood still, torn between his pride and the reality of the situation. The growing crowd, the cameras, the reporter, they all bore witness to his actions. His mind screamed at him to stop, but his ego clung to the idea that backing down would mean defeat. No, Brown muttered through gritted teeth. He thinks he can walk away because he's a general. I won't allow it. Martinez sighed deeply, his frustration evident. Derek, he said quietly, his tone almost pleading, let him go. This isn't about him anymore. It's about you. Don't let your anger destroy everything you've worked for. Those words finally broke through the haze clouding Brown's mind. With a heavy sigh, he released his grip on Evans's wrist and stepped back. His shoulders slumped, the fight draining from him. Fine, he murmured, his voice barely audible. Evans slowly turned to face Brown. His gaze was steady but not hostile, filled instead with quiet disappointment. I hope you'll reflect on this, Evans said calmly. He walked back to his SUV, opened the door, and drove away without another word. The crowd began to disperse, the tension in the air gradually dissipating, but the damage had already been done. At the fallout, Brown returned to his patrol car and sat in the driver's seat, his hands trembling as they gripped the steering wheel. His mind swirled with emotions, anger, shame, fear. He knew he hadn't just lost control of the situation. He'd lost control of himself. Martinez approached the car, his expression grave. Derek, he said softly, you went too far. Brown didn't respond. He stared blankly ahead, the weight of his actions settling over him like a suffocating blanket. Deep down, he knew the situation was beyond repair. The damage wasn't just to his career, it was to his sense of self, to the ideals he had once believed he upheld. Hours later, the fallout began. Videos of the incident flooded social media, showing Brown's excessive force and irrational behavior. Criticism poured in from all sides. Colleagues, superiors, and the public. The headlines were damning. Officer abuses power in confrontation with military hero. At the station, Brown felt the shift in the atmosphere. His colleagues avoided his gaze, their usual camaraderie replaced by tense silence. Even simple greetings vanished. It was as if he had been marked, isolated by his own actions. Sitting at his desk, Brown tried to focus on his reports, but the words blurred. The memories of the confrontation replayed in his mind, a loop of regret and humiliation. Just minutes into his futile attempt to work, the sharp voice of Captain Harkness broke the silence. Brown, in my office. Now, the consequences of pride. Captain Harkness's words struck Brown's pride like a hammer. He wanted to respond, to justify himself, but deep down, he knew that no explanation could undo what had been done. The damage was irreparable. Harkness took a deep breath, his stern expression softening slightly. I've received calls from the top, he said, and I don't need to tell you what that means. We're under investigation. And you're suspended immediately until the investigation is complete. Brown sat in stunned silence, his hands clenched into fists under the table. Suspended, he stammered, his voice trembling. The word felt like a death sentence for his career. Though he had braced himself for this moment, hearing it spoken aloud made the reality unbearably clear. This wasn't just about his job. His entire life was unraveling before his eyes. Derek, I can't cover for you on this, Harkness continued, his tone steady but tinged with regret. This investigation is going to dig deep into every case you've ever worked on, and if there's anything unusual, he didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication hung heavy in the air. Brown understood all too well what that meant. This wasn't just about his confrontation with Marcus Evans. Every decision he had made, every moment of lost temper, every questionable call during his career would now come under scrutiny. And if even a single misstep surfaced, it would be the end. Isolation. Brown left Harkness's office with a heavy heart, his footsteps dragging as though the weight of the world had been placed on his shoulders. It wasn't just his career he was losing, it was his sense of identity. He had built his life around his role as an enforcer of the law, someone who believed he stood for justice. Now he was branded as the very thing he despised, a symbol of abuse, prejudice. Returning to his desk, Brown found no solace. The pride he once felt while sitting there had been replaced by a hollow emptiness. His colleagues, once friendly and supportive, now avoided him. Conversations stopped abruptly when he entered a room, and no one met his gaze. The unspoken silence suffocated him, each avoided glance cutting deeper than words ever could. Every evening, Brown returned home more broken than when he had left. The loneliness was crushing. His phone became a source of torment. Each swipe brought fresh waves of criticism, angry comments, and even threats. The video of his confrontation with General Evans was everywhere, dissected and condemned by strangers online. It seemed as though the entire world had turned against him. The isolation grew unbearable. Old friends distanced themselves, and even his family struggled to offer comfort. Brown felt like a pariah, unwelcome both in his community and within his own mind. Each morning became a battle to find a reason to keep going, to drag himself out of bed despite the suffocating despair. The investigation deepens. Brown replayed the confrontation with Evans in his mind, each moment haunting him like a recurring nightmare. He couldn't escape the truth. He had failed. He had let his emotions take control, acting on anger and bias rather than reason. That single moment had cost him everything: his career, his honor, and his self. One morning as he sat at his kitchen table, lost in thought, a loud knock at the door jolted him to attention. His heart pounded as he opened the door to find two men in sharp suits standing before him. Their expressions were grave. "Officer Derek Brown," one of the men said, his voice cold and precise. "We're FBI agents. We have a few questions regarding the incident with General Marcus Evans." The words hit Brown like a freight train. The FBI, this wasn't just an internal matter anymore. It escalated to a national level. Brown's heart sank as he realized the gravity of the situation. He invited the agents inside, trying to maintain a semblance of composure. They wasted no time, sitting at his dining table and diving straight into the interrogation. "Why did you feel the need to use force on General Evans during that traffic stop?" one of the agents asked, his voice sharp and probing. Brown hesitated, struggling to find an answer. "He was violating traffic laws, and I was following protocol," he managed weakly. "We've seen the video," the second agent interjected, his gaze unwavering. "There was no justification for your actions, especially when the general showed no resistance. So, why did you act the way you did?" The question cut deep. Brown had asked himself the same thing countless times, but the answer eluded him. The truth was painful. His actions had been driven by pride, anger, and resentment, not by any sense of duty. I thought he might be hiding something," Brown stammered. I acted on instinct." "Instinct?" the agent repeated, his tone laced with skepticism. "Use force on an unresisting man? On a decorated general? Because of instinct? Do you understand the implications of that?" Brown's stomach churned. He wanted to defend himself, to say it was a mistake, that he hadn't intended for things to spiral so far out of control, but deep down he knew it didn't matter. His words couldn't erase what he had done. A dark door opens. The interrogation continued, the agent's questions cutting deeper and deeper into Brown's already fragile psyche. They weren't just focused on the Evans incident. They made it clear they would be reviewing his entire career. "We'll be examining every case you've worked on," one agent said bluntly. "If we find any signs of misconduct or abuse, you will be held accountable." The words echoed in Brown's mind, each syllable a hammer blow to his sense of self. Every mistake he had ever made, every moment of lost temper, every gray area he had tried to forget. They were all coming back to haunt him. The investigation would lay bare every flaw, every failure, and every misuse of power. After the agents left, Brown sat on his couch, his hands shaking. The silence of his home was deafening, amplifying the storm in his mind. He replayed past moments, decisions he had brushed aside as minor missteps. Now, they felt like open wounds, bleeding under the harsh light of scrutiny. The walls seemed to close in around him. His career, his reputation, his future, all hung by a thread, and he had no way of stopping the unraveling. He had built his life on the idea of justice, but now he was a symbol of everything he had fought against. The irony was crushing, the weight of regret. Day by day, the pressure mounted. The media continued to dissect the incident, his face plastered across headlines condemning his abuse of power. Public outrage grew, and Brown's isolation deepened. He had once believed in his strength, his ability to withstand anything, but now he felt like a ship adrift, battered by storms with no anchor in sight. Sitting in the darkness of his living room, Brown realized the full extent of his failure. He had allowed his pride and anger to destroy not only his career, but his sense of self. He had betrayed the very values he once vowed to uphold, and there was no escaping the consequences. His future was no longer his own. It lay in the hands of those who would judge him, who would decide whether he deserved forgiveness or condemnation. Reflection and isolation. Derek Brown sat in the dimly lit silence of his house, the once warm and inviting space now a hollow reminder of what his life used to be. He stared at the walls, their emptiness a reflection of his own despair, the echoes of happier days, days when he was respected, confident, and proud of his work, felt like distant shadows haunting his thoughts. Back then, he thought himself invincible, untouchable. Now everything he had built, everything he believed in was crumbling. He couldn't stop the relentless questions that tormented him. How did I end up here? He thought of the decisions, the arrogance, and the unchecked anger that had led him to this moment. Words and actions he once dismissed as insignificant now loomed large in his conscience, impossible to erase. The man who had once prided himself on integrity was now drowning in regret. Struggling to comprehend how far he had fallen, Brown's despair was all-encompassing. His career, his dignity, and his belief in his own worth had abandoned him. He was left with nothing but the weight of his mistakes and the gnawing uncertainty of whether he could ever make amends. Public outrage. The fallout from Brown's confrontation with General Marcus Evans had snowballed into something far beyond his control. The video of the incident continued to circulate, fueling protests and calls for reform. Brown's name became synonymous with abuse of power and racial prejudice, a lightning rod for outrage and condemnation. For General Evans, the incident turned him into a symbol of resilience and a champion for justice. He spoke at public events, appeared on talk shows, and became a central figure in the movement for police reform. His calm yet passionate advocacy resonated with marginalized communities and human rights organizations. Evans used his platform not just to recount the details of the confrontation, but to shed light on systemic issues within law enforcement. This isn't just about me, Evans said in a televised interview. It's about everyone who has endured discrimination and abuse without a voice. We can't let incidents like this happen without a response. It's time for profound change in our justice system. Evans's words inspired protests across the nation, with demonstrators demanding accountability and systemic reform. Signs and banners bore Brown's name, branding him as the face of everything wrong within the system. The pressure on the police department intensified, and the scrutiny of Brown's actions expanded to include his entire career. The crumbling foundation. At work, Brown's isolation grew unbearable. Once respected by his colleagues, he was now treated like an outcast. Conversations ceased when he entered a room and no one met his eyes. His assignments dwindled to meaningless tasks, a clear sign that his presence was no longer valued. The internal investigation delved into every corner of his career, unearthing past mistakes and missteps he had long buried. Each new revelation chipped away at what little remained of his reputation. At home, the situation was no better. His wife, once proud of his service, could no longer hide her worry and disappointment. Their children felt the ripple effects of the scandal, facing whispers and judgment from their peers. Brown's guilt was overwhelming, but his helplessness cut deeper. He couldn't protect his family from the storm he had created. As each day passed, Brown's sense of self eroded further. The house that had once been a refuge became a prison, a constant reminder of the life he had destroyed. Every memory of past achievements was tainted by the knowledge that his actions had betrayed the principles he once held dear. Evans' voice. One afternoon, Brown sat in his living room, unable to look away from the television screen. General Marcus Evans appeared on a national program, his calm yet resolute demeanor captivating the audience. The interview wasn't just about the confrontation with Brown, it was a broader discussion about systemic issues within law enforcement and society as a whole. "This isn't just something that happened to me," Evans said, his voice steady. "It's something that people of color face daily. We need change, not just to prevent future incidents like this, but to reform the entire system to ensure justice is truly served." Evans's words struck Brown like a blow. He had never imagined that his actions could have such far-reaching consequences. What he saw as a fleeting moment of authority had become a symbol of everything wrong with the system he was sworn to uphold. The man he had sought to control was now a national figure, using his platform to inspire change and demand accountability. "I want this incident to be a catalyst for society as a whole," Evans continued, his conviction unwavering. "We can't allow abuses of this nature to continue unchecked." Brown's chest tightened as he listened. He had once believed in his power as an enforcer of the law, but now he realized the depth of his failure. His actions had not only tarnished his reputation, but had also fueled a movement calling for systemic reform. A glimmer of hope. In the midst of his despair, Brown felt a faint flicker of something he hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. As he replayed Evans's words in his mind, he began to wonder if there was a way forward. Could he, too, become a part of the change that Evans was advocating for? Could he use his mistakes as a lesson, a turning point, rather than a sentence of ruin? "I can't give up now," Brown whispered to himself, his voice trembling but resolute. His mistakes couldn't be undone, but perhaps there was a way to make amends. The path ahead would be long and grueling, but for the first time in weeks, Brown felt the faintest hint of purpose. He couldn't change the past, but he could try to shape a better future, an endless downward spiral. In the days following the incident, Derek Brown couldn't shake the overwhelming anxiety and fear that gripped him. Everywhere he went, he felt the weight of judgment. His neighbors' wary stares, his colleagues' cold indifference, and worst of all, his own guilt. But the most suffocating burden was the public exposure of his identity. To the world, he wasn't just a disgraced officer, he had become a symbol of abuse, arrogance, and prejudice. The movement sparked by General Marcus Evans continued to grow, igniting forums, discussions, and protests across the country. What had begun as a single moment on a small-town road had transformed into a national reckoning. Awareness of injustices that had long been ignored swept through the neighborhood, the city, and beyond. For Brown, the world had irreversibly changed. There was no longer room for unchecked power or the discrimination he had once wielded so carelessly. General Evans, meanwhile, used the incident to drive meaningful change. He tirelessly advocated for reform, transforming his personal ordeal into a force for good. His speeches, interviews, and campaigns inspired hope in marginalized communities, forcing a spotlight onto issues of racial injustice and systemic abuse. Brown, however, felt the world around him closing in. Each day it seemed the walls of prejudice and criticism pressed harder, leaving him with no escape. Everywhere he went, Evans's words echoed in his mind, reminding him of the impact of his actions and the inescapable truth. His past would follow him like a shadow, no matter where he went. The crushing weight of guilt. Brown had briefly considered leaving town, finding a faraway place where no one knew his name, where he could start over. But deep down, he knew that no distance could free him from the guilt that gnawed at his soul. It wasn't just the public condemnation that haunted him, it was the regret, the realization that he had failed to live up to the ideals he once believed in. No matter how far he ran, the weight of his actions would always find him. Every time he looked in the mirror, he saw not the proud officer he once thought himself to be, but a man consumed by anger and pride, someone who allowed those emotions to destroy everything he had built. His reflection had become unrecognizable. The determination and confidence that once shone in his eyes had been replaced by shame and emptiness. He no longer saw himself as a man of justice, but as someone whose actions had betrayed everything he claimed to stand for. Isolation and despair. In the weeks that followed, Brown's isolation grew unbearable. Calls from friends dwindled until they stopped entirely. Colleagues at the station avoided him, their conversations halting whenever he entered the room. The judgment in their eyes was clear, even if they didn't voice it aloud. Brown's family couldn't escape the fallout either. His wife, once proud of his service, now looked at him with a mix of worry and disappointment. Their children, once eager to share stories about their father, became distant, unable to escape the whispers and rumors that followed them everywhere. At work, Brown's responsibilities shrank to meaningless tasks. His presence was tolerated but no longer valued. The internal investigation unearthed every mistake he had ever made, each one adding to the narrative of him as a corrupt and abusive officer. The weight of his past misdeeds became impossible to bear, each revelation chipping away Evans's legacy. Brown couldn't escape the growing movement for change. Every day he saw Marcus Evans on television or heard his name in conversations. Evans's calm yet resolute voice resonated across the nation, his words fueling protests and discussions about systemic reform. "This isn't just about me," Evans had said during a televised interview. "It's about everyone who has endured discrimination and abuse without a voice. We can't let incidents like this happen without a response. It's time for profound change in how we treat each other and in our justice system." Those words hit Brown like a hammer. He realized that his actions had become far more than a personal failure. They were now a symbol of a broken system. What he had dismissed as a fleeting moment of authority had ignited a revolution, and the man he had sought to control had turned the tables, becoming a voice for justice and equality. The final reflection. Sitting alone in his quiet living room, Brown stared out the window as the sun set, the fading light casting long shadows across the walls. He thought about the moment that had changed everything, the split-second decision born of anger and pride that had unraveled his entire life. The consequences were undeniable, and the guilt was inescapable. He thought of Marcus Evans, standing tall and composed despite the injustice he had faced. Evans's resilience and strength were a stark contrast to Brown's own descent into despair. Brown couldn't help but wonder if there was any way to atone for what he had done, but the more he thought about it, the more hopeless it seemed. The past couldn't be undone, and the future felt impossibly bleak. "Ripit Kamei! Come on out!" For the first time in his life, Brown truly understood what it meant to feel powerless. The authority he had once wielded so recklessly was gone, leaving him with nothing but the consequences of his actions. The man who had once believed in his strength and control now sat broken, consumed by regret and shame. And yet, as he sat there in silence, one question lingered in his mind. Could he ever find redemption? Or would he forever be haunted by the mistakes he had made? Brown's life would never be the same. The proud officer who once believed he was above reproach was now a shadow of his former self, trapped in the unforgiving reality of his own making. The road to redemption, if it existed, would be long and uncertain. But for now, all Brown could do was sit in the darkness, consumed by the weight of his unforgivable mistakes.